All right, switching gears now to some environmental news. You might remember 3 years ago when New York passed a landmark law called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It's considered the most ambitious climate law in the country, and a big part of it was about improving air quality. Now, for some of you, that might not be a problem, and for others, it could be a problem and you just don't know it. But for other communities in New York, air pollution is a huge issue, and the residents of those communities have borne the brunt of that damage. So the state is now launching a first-in-the-nation project to measure and monitor air quality statewide. This week, we take you to the start of that project across the state. Take a look.
Governor Kathy Hochul first announced the statewide Community Air Monitoring Initiative during the September 2021 Climate Week. It's the first statewide air quality monitoring effort in the United States. And last month, the work began to map hyperlocal air pollution and greenhouse gases across the state of New York. Monitoring is underway in the Bronx, Buffalo Niagara Falls area, the Capital Region, and Manhattan. And 6 additional communities will start monitoring this fall. The initiative is using mobile mapping technology and professional analytics from a private company called Aclima. New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation hopes the data will drive strategies to address air quality issues in New York's most vulnerable communities, while contributing to the state's nation-leading climate goals.
So this is the beginning of this really incredible initiative that no other state has done. And we're doing it in order to improve lives and improve health all across New York.
The use of data to monitor air quality is not new, but where that data comes from and how it's collected is unique.
We in New York want to find out what air people are breathing, and that means using the best available technology. We've been doing that for years with stationary monitoring sources all around the state, but times have changed. There's now new technologies that are available, and we knew that we could go to the next level, which is actually bringing our monitoring down to the ground level.
Aclima and the company's CEO, Davida Herzl, are pioneering an entirely new way to diagnose the health of our air and track climate-changing pollution. Powered by their network of roving and stationary sensors, Aclima measures air pollution and greenhouse gases at unprecedented scales and with block-by-block resolution.
We've developed specialized sensors. So it's a small device that sits in the back of a vehicle or on a vehicle. And those sensors are collecting data once per second through a tube that is gathering air outside the vehicle. And then it comes into the sensor. We analyze the data on board, and then it goes to the cloud, where all of the measurements get stitched together into these maps. But we're measuring multiple different pollutants at the same time. So all of the pollutants that impact human health, all the greenhouse gases, as well as toxics. So the kinds of toxic pollutants that are associated with petrochemical production and other uses of fossil fuels.
So by putting this technology into the back of these vehicles that are traveling around constantly on loops over the course of a year, we're then getting down to the lot level what people are breathing at the street level. And that's incredibly important because that enables us to then make policy decisions based on the stuff that we're finding and what people are breathing very locally, not just regionally.
The science has shown that air pollution varies by up to 800% from one block to the next. And so in order to really understand where those emissions that are changing the climate and are impacting people, to understand where they're coming from and to understand who they're impacting, you need to be able to measure them at this really high resolution because pollution varies so much from one address, from one block to the next.
The 10 communities selected for monitoring were identified as having a disproportionate air pollution burden based on criteria developed by the state's Climate Justice Working Group. The boundaries for monitoring in each area were determined using community input and current understanding of pollution sources.
It was intentional. We were very intentional about selecting disadvantaged communities for this purpose, particularly in communities of color, disadvantaged communities that have borne the brunt of pollution for years.
The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, passed in New York in 2019, recognizes that climate change doesn't affect all communities equally. The law tasked the Climate Justice Working Group with the development of criteria to identify disadvantaged communities to ensure that frontline and otherwise underserved communities benefit from the state's historic transition to cleaner, greener sources of energy, reduced pollution, and cleaner air and economic opportunities. Arif Ullah is the executive director of South Bronx Unite.
I think that it's safe to say that communities like ours, primarily Black, brown, and low-income communities, have endured the racist legacy of redlining, which saw it entirely appropriate to burden us with one polluting facility after another. And we've shouldered this heavy consequence of the fossil fuel economy, of pollution, of climate change, and many other environmental injustices for decades. And so with this initiative that the DEC has announced to document air pollution, we'll be able to have the hard data we need to be able to strengthen our advocacy. We know, people in our community already know that the air is toxic, and we have been saying that for many years, but now that will be backed up by data that supports what we've been saying, and that will strengthen our advocacy.
There are hotspots within disadvantaged communities, diesel trucks, localized sources of air pollution that are very significant. Being able to get it down on the street in those communities and select those 10 communities and find out where those problems are enables us to then put those solutions in place.
Resources that will come into our community as a result of the documentation of air pollution that the DEC is doing, as a result of the policies that we'll hopefully be able to bring about. These are exactly the types of resources that our community needs to be able to really mitigate the air pollution and improve the air quality in our community.
Deploying resources where they are needed most is paramount to combat the changing climate of the world and here in New York State. And that's just impossible without the data.
None of us can survive without breathing for a few minutes, and yet we don't have the data to ensure that we are, as human beings, really living, creating the most healthy possible environments for each other, and two, that we're creating a long-term sustainable planet. And so we figured out how to generate those measurements so that now we have the data to understand the problem really at that granular scale and drive action. And that's why I'm just so impressed with what the state is doing, with the governor's leadership, with Basil's leadership, to really say we're committing to measurement so that, to maximize accountability, maximize transparency, and really take action that we can measure and know, are the investments that we're making actually having a benefit? So it's a huge deal.
We see incredible change through the climate crisis that we're now subject to. We see it here in New York. We felt it in 2012 with Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Ida last year, flooding parts of New York City, dramatic damage. Just a few months before that, I was up in Steuben County, rural New York, with a flood that wiped out a couple of villages. And this is an equal opportunity crisis. It is really hitting everybody at the same time, and we may not always see it, but we need to act. We need to react and act and get proactive, and that's really fundamentally why New York is taking this action with this mobile air monitoring program, is so that we can act effectively and make change.